Hello, Isaac.
Hello, Rabbi. Good morning. It's great to see you.
Good morning. Good to see you. Again, matching background. Very
And
exciting.
that's right. It's matching background and it is exciting. Yeah.
It just
Uh-huh.
means we're in the same place right now. We're not
Yes.
separated by hundreds of miles. Okay, so
Well,
I'm sure like we're in the call of Levi, also called the call of Matthew, also called the call of Levi, son of Alphaeus. This is the famous story. This is the mention of Matthew, the tax collector, the man at the tax booth from the book of the Gospel according to Matthew. So this arguably is a very important story. We only did verse one, which would be 9:9 of just Jesus coming and meeting him. And we mentioned that this is one of the many follow me or not follow me stories that we see in the New Testament. But today we're actually going to fly through a lot of the story. What I'd like to do is you can read the whole story, but we're not going to do the last verse
okay.
story because 9:9 to 9:13. 9:13 is its own session, but we'll do three verses today, which is two more than we usually do. So very
Okay.
exciting.
Okay. So it's 10, 11, 12, right?
Yeah, but you can start from 9:9 just to give the context.
Okay. Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation because this is a very famous passage. At least culturally, Christians look at this in different perspectives. Where,
Yeah, I can't wait to
anyway,
hear
so
what you and the
yeah.
Christian community says about it.
Well, so I can't wait to hear what you say of this and how you come at this from a Jewish perspective. So
So we're
looking
both
for
excited to hear each other. This is a great state of affairs.
That's a great state of it. And that's the intended goal. So thank you. Well, on that note, the gospel according to Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." Well, okay, let's stop.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. Either way. So again, we hear this question that I think is going to keep plaguing us, and maybe it plagued the apostles as well. Who is Jesus here for? What's he trying to accomplish? It's such a funny thing. In general, when you have a mission in life, uh, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. So it's always unclear what Jesus, like if I tell you, what was Jesus trying to get to? Was he trying to bring about a new age? It sounds like over here, there's another attitude. He's not here for everyone. You all over there, it sounds like, are doing just fine. And I'm only here for these people. So I feel like we're always going to keep struggling about who is Jesus talking to? Because let's be honest, he says, follow me to some people. Other people, as we noted, he doesn't say anything. Other people serve him. Other people, he says, go away. Other people says, follow me on condition. The apostles, even at the end of Matthew, seem to be struggling with who they are and what is their relationship to Jesus. And I would say a fortiori for us, like, what is the relationship of Christians today, Jesus? Because I think like any Christian today some would ignore this. They say, Jesus was here for everybody, period. And that would be the end of the statement. But what Jesus just is always never saying that. Jesus actually could have been ambiguous about it. He could have said, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But he actually says, I'm here for you. I'm not here for you. I want you to follow me. I don't want you to follow me. You will see this in the future. You won't see this in the future. And if anything, he gives a very non-ubiquitous message. He gives a message that seems it's for different cohorts, different cadres, different groups of people. It's the exclusion of others. So I think like as a Christian, who most Christians are going to be a lot bit more ubiquitous about like Christianity is for everybody, and more of an evangelical attitude on it. And therefore, it's just hard to read Matthew and from Jesus' perspective. So to start, before we go a little bit analyze the historical context of this, I'd love to hear. So how is this? Why is this so important for Christians today?
Yeah, so I would also make a distinction between the folks with the liberal bent to a conservative bent. And so this aspect of, so, I think this dichotomy between a sinner and a Pharisee, as in holy people, Pharisees as in people who kept the law, lived a good life, versus sinners who probably made a mess of themselves and didn't do these good things, right? Those dichotomies, they still play out today, right? And so as human beings, we always have a tendency that we want to hang out with people who look like us, who are similar to us, have similar value systems. Like we would not, again, the idea that, so when you read of tax collectors, to put ourselves in those shoes, we saw last time that it's better to be a thief than to be a tax collector. I mean, like those are very, very, very strong words. As in, like, I mean, we don't fully understand the magnitude of those words. And so in today's day and age, as in, given who we are, we want to hang out with ourselves. Like this is a call. This in a way pushes people to say, it's not about who you are. Like God's message is for, like, again, socialize with other people, people who don't look like you, people who don't think like you, people who might not have the same life story as you. And so, like, these messages play out very different. Again, themes of this, they come out differently. um and this call of those who have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, or those who are well have no need of a physician. I see we're coming from where maybe he was calling some and not the others, right? But I think Christianity was more focused on, like, you want to go reach the other, like someone who doesn't look like you. So there's been less of a focus on the exclusionary bent of this, but a focus on reaching out to those who don't have a similar life story or value like you. And so I think that's speaking at a very broad level. Tax collectors and sinners, and that Jesus hung out with them. And so in Christian circles where the focus is on outreach, on social aspects of social justice, aspects of probably not, maybe aspects of proselytizing, this calling of you want to do these things. I think these themes play out. And so this is a very common message, and probably also verse 4, 9:13, which we'll discuss the next time.
Yeah,
Mercy and us.
so you're definitely framing it. Maybe tell me if I'm saying it wrong. That I think this is one of the attitudes that certain people in the Black community have. That if we treat everyone equal, it's technically discriminating against maybe the Black community because there's been so much disparaging of this community historically that the only way to like fight for an equitable justice perspective in the Black community is by rectifying that, by creating almost an unevenness that if I have to choose two people and they're exactly equal, you should choose the Black person in that community because that is a way to rectify the historical wrongs in that situation. So I feel like you were trying to maybe bifurcate the Christian community into the majority and the other, the people who look different, the people who act different, the people who smell different, the people who are taller, shorter, poorer, richer, the other, what we would call. And it could be the other is 49% of the community. It could be even the other is 70% of the community, because the majority sometimes will just be 30%, and then there'll be 10% of all these different ones. So are you trying to say that the Christian community or Jesus was very worried about the other to the exclusion of the majority or what they would call their cultural norm, or is he
Yeah.
trying to be equally worried? And it could be like when you look at this the Black community precedent by obviously not everyone, but by some to try to right the historical wrong, it accidentally or proactively excludes certain people who are the majority, the people who are the norms. And in this case, it might be the Jews, the Pharisees. It might just be people who have a normal Roman culture. Unclear. It could just be quote unquote the sinners.
Yeah, that's a great, again, you bring up a great point. Now, I cannot speak to that because I'm not familiar. I haven't seen that perspective. I've seen this play out politically where certain communities have been so subdued that it cannot be equal. We have to give them preference,
Well,
right?
we see this at
So,
awards. I just saw this at an award show where they asked the woman, like, who do you want to win? She goes, I'm rooting for Black people. So,
yeah,
so she would her attitude was that the Black person, I have to stand up and fight for those people because that is where I'm holding in this historical epic. That now the way to right these wrongs is by treating the equity that has to be equaled out, and that is
yeah.
by erring on the side, pushing the scale on one side.
Yeah, I think, okay, so that's in the context of ethics and how people look at the world, what they want to do. I think what I was trying to say earlier was I'd seen this mainly play through the context of proselytizing, of missions, of working with folks of the other, right? As in, missions was quite common in the Christian circles, as in doing things for others. And so in that context, there's a focus on why would you hang out with yourself? You want to go spend time, proselytize them, share God's love with people who don't look like you. And so the word sinners plays it very differently in today's day and age. We don't think of, like, if I were to translate tax collectors to today's day and age, right? We probably don't think of, maybe let's say, how do I say this?
Well, I think tax collectors, the equivalent today would be like mobsters.
Mobsters.
So the
Ah,
reason, like, for
okay.
example, when we spoke yesterday about they enter your house and they become tame, impure, it's because they would just go and do whatever they want and touch what they want and be able to take whatever they want. So I think that the closest equivalent would be a person in the mob.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, I think, yeah, I can, I can see that. I can see that where, you know, why would you, again, maybe there are also a few, it doesn't come to mind right now, few stories of how Christians have worked with folk on the edges, on the edges of society, folks who've been neglected by society. And so I think I've seen this passage play out mainly in that context, as in there are all these folks who've been neglected in society, there are fringes of the society. As a church, you want to engage with them, bring, be a part, like, there cannot be this here, I and you, this divide between them and us. And so when Jesus did this, it's a call to go be with them. So that's the perspective I'm mostly familiar. But I think the one you're bringing about, a person of color saying, I want to root for a person of color because he was historically subdued. I
Right.
think that
It's more
that's
of, affirmative action.
yeah, so that's more to do with social justice, more ethics. I was talking more in the context of missions, so this was more, again, Christian circles have done this more in the context of missions, of proselytizing, of sharing God's love, of being with them, like being, classic example would be the homeless. There's no reason for a person to hang out with the homeless, but I've seen places where, like, contexts where passages like this are used, where you want to spend time with them, get to know their story, be with them, right? I think that what you're what you're alluding to, I think that goes above and beyond. I mean, that's more for political. It's more involved with politics and social ethics and how folks see this world and how the ethics shapes this world. That's yeah. Anyway, so that's my
Okay.
initial thought.
So let's just before like we have a lot to say on this. So before we do, I just want to like a lot of times there's an interesting interplay between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I think this is one of the few stories where Matthew, the part from Matthew seems to be after Luke. And you can't really read this story without Luke because you have follow me, and he followed him. So Jesus says, follow me, but then they end up at his house. That's a contradiction because Jesus wasn't going to lead the tax collector, Matthew, to Matthew's house. That makes no sense. These lines are unreadable next to each other. When you look at Mark, it doesn't really help us. He says, follow me. He got up and followed him, and he sat at dinner. Unreadable, contradiction. Luke comes and saves the day. Jesus says, follow me. And he got up, left everything, and followed him. And that actually, the follow me becomes meaningful in that he threw away all his tax money, he threw away all his possessions. So now it's Luke has a very meaningful follow me. And then Levi in verse 529 in Luke says, and Levi gave a great banquet for him in his house. So it wasn't Jesus wasn't saying follow me literally as it is implied in Matthew and Mark. Jesus is saying follow my ways, and he threw away everything. And then what are you supposed to go now? He goes, I don't know, let's have a banquet to celebrate. So they go to Levi's house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting, where at Levi's house in Mark, it says tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for they were many who followed him. So at the Mark table, you have the most people. You
Mhm.
have the tax collectors, you have the sinners, you have Jesus, the disciples, and Matthew slash Levi. At the Luke table, he gets rid of the disciples because that's a meaningless, that's not part of the story. And you only have, there's a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting. There's another group, whoever, and then Matthew gets to the point. Matthew goes, I don't care if there are disciples there. Garbage, doesn't matter. I don't care if there are others there. Doesn't matter. The only two groups that matter, who, for the point of the story, are the tax collectors and the disciples sitting with him. And then it mentions at the side, and they were disciples as well. But the main point is the sinners and the tax collectors. So what we see is that they go back there. So before I want to give an analysis of what's taking place, I just want you to also note you view the tax collectors and the sinners as the other. I want to actually make the argument that they're not the other, but the Pharisees and disciples are the other. Because when you look at this, where do they go back? They go back, have a big banquet. There's lots of people come, according to Luke, sinners are coming, and others are sitting at the table, whoever. This was a popular guy. This is a guy who had money who could feed other people. Don't forget how food insecurity would have played out in the first century. This is a person who has money. Not only that, who else would probably have money? The sinners. So I think a lot of times when we view these people as, it sound like you were viewing them as vulnerable. I view them as the opposite of the vulnerable. They're the
Yeah.
ones who are offending and attacking the vulnerable by sinning. It could be we're only talking about religious sins that these people wouldn't say the right prayers in the morning, but more likely than not, a sinner is a thief. A sinner is someone who aggrieves other people. Someone who is a tax collector is someone who is a mobster, who goes and takes your things. So while you would view this as the other, I would view the actual Jews in the Roman Empire as the other. So I just want to note that
Yeah.
the otherness is at least ambiguous and unclear. And at most, these are people who are financially well off.
Well, okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. So if Jesus went with, when Jesus went with Levi or Matthew to his house, of course, at his house, you would not expect Pharisees. He's a tax collector, and so all his friends were tax collectors. And so, in that sense, it makes perfect sense. He went to his house, and in his house were tax collectors. So when they use the word sinners, right, from the last time, because tax collectors were seen as so bad, I had seen this as just tax collectors, and so I didn't see sinners as a
But in
separate.
Luke, it also says others, just
Yeah,
people hanging out.
yes. So looking at Matthew, so if Jesus went to his house, of course, right? Like if I came to your house, of course you'll have, as a Jewish friend, you'll have you'll have, there'll be other Jewish folks in your place, and so I looked at
Well,
this as,
I don't think that's automatic. I think the only people who could really house a lot of people at their house were wealthy people who could fit a lot of people in their house, and the only people who could feed people regularly were people who could had a lot of money to feed people. This is not the Sabbath, it's not a holiday, it's a random day.
yeah,
They just come
I,
home and there's a lot of people who are ready
yeah.
to eat. This is
I
an
yeah,
entourage.
yeah, Rabbi, I think I would push back. So when we read of Jesus, right, he was traveling like a traveling salesman, traveling preacher, but he needed food to eat. There's always people around him. We only have one or two instances of of him feeding five loaves, feeding 5,000 people. But then there are other days you had to have food. So I assume that the broader culture was more communal. Like food was, I mean, yeah, food. To your point, it is. It's not like today's day and age where before you go, you have to call somebody, make reservations, make sure they're okay. We go, they have enough food. Maybe in that time, life was more communal, where the view of food and
So that's
meals.
definitely true in certain areas.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that today. I don't think that's the case here.
Okay.
If you
Yeah.
look at
Can I?
Luke, it says that Levi gave a great banquet for him at the house.
Yeah. Fair enough. So now, as a tax collector, right? So he had wealth, like just like Zacchaeus or Zacchaeus, like Levi in this case, he had wealth, and so and so
I just think you have to redefine your other when you read this. That's what I'm saying.
and so what I find surprising is that, like, Matthew is a tax collector. Jesus said, follow him. And they went to Matthew's house. Why did the Pharisees come to Matthew's house? He's a tax collector. So were the Pharisees following Jesus? And so when I say the other, I
It
also mean,
doesn't, you know,
Rabbi, so when I
it
say
doesn't
the
say
other,
that.
right?
It doesn't say they're at his house, right? It says when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples. So A, they didn't address, according to Matthew at least, they didn't address Jesus. They were seeing like this is junk. This
Yeah.
is crazy. These are the mobsters. How could a guy who wants to be a spiritual leader be hanging out with the literally the trash of society, the people who are hurting us on a daily basis?
Yeah. And so, when I read this, I assume like Jesus is at Matthew's place, the disciples are there. And so the Pharisees asked the disciples, and Jesus heard that, then they all had to be within close proximity. I assume they're all within, within distance where they were there. Now, I cannot imagine. Well, maybe this could be the case where that the Pharisees told the disciples, and then the disciples came and told Jesus. That could be the case. That was not my read. I read this as like they were in the vicinity. They saw this. They made a comment. He was perceptive. He responded. He responded to that. Given what we learned about tax collectors, how they are wealthy, and maybe Levi over his years he's accumulated wealth. Again, when
It's
they say,
actually, what you're saying about the Pharisees. When we look at the last story with Pharisees, and he specifically the healing of the paralytic, we see that Jesus uh, says, "You guys are thinking this." They actually don't confront Jesus. In verse 9:4, it says, Jesus perceiving their thoughts says, "Why do you think evil in your heart?" And that's how it shows up in Luke and Matthew and Mark as well. At once Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing. Anyway, so they don't confront him. And also in this story, we see that they do not confront him. And maybe we'll have to make some philosophy about when Pharisees confront, but it's very clear in these last two stories, Pharisees don't confront Jesus at all. They
Mhm.
confront his disciples in the story, and they say to themselves in the last story. So it looks like they're not very confrontational of Jesus. They're very condemning of what he's doing to
Yeah.
themselves and to those around him, but they don't directly address Jesus.
Yeah, great point. So, again, this verse, right, 9:11, I also see this as being, it's, a quest of curiosity. Like, I don't see this as confronting or accusing, like, hey, like, why does your teacher eat with other
Oh,
tax
definitely more in curiosity.
Okay.
It's
So, but
definitely
no, again, we want to assume positive intent. And so I go, he seems like if he's a rabbi and you're all following he's Jewish, like, why would you do these things?
in Luke, it even says it again. Luke, I think, is the most clear version of the story. In Luke 5:30, it says the Pharisee and their scribes were complaining to his disciples. It actually
Yeah.
uses the negative language of complaining. Anyways, so I want to. So one thing that you probably think about this is just he's Jesus is actively engaging sinners and actively engaging tax collectors. But one thing that you probably are unaware of is that there's this group of Jews called Chaverim. Chaverim, it means Chaver is a friend. And Chaver, I want to tell you all about them really quickly. And I think it'll change your understanding of the story really, really quickly. And every single Jew, not every Jew, but of many Jews, and definitely all Pharisees, would have been very aware of Chaverim. And people who wanted to be Pharisees some of them would have been this Chaver group and but it would have been a higher level of ritual community. So chaver, as I meant, it means a friend, and it denotes a member of the first and second, specifically that time period, first century society that would carry out perfectly the observance of the food purity laws. A lot of times when we talk about impurity and purity in Judaism, you probably think it talks about dead corpses, but practically, corpses were at least reasonably uncommon. How often they'd interact with them? Once a year, once every 6 months, but they would interact with food 3 times a day. And the agricultural laws, specifically in the Bible, that says that 2% of your donation has to go to the priest. 10% of the leftover donation has to go to Levites. 10% of the donation to Levites has to go to the priests. The next 10% has to go to the poor and or eaten in Jerusalem. Every 7 years, the crop has to be left fallow. So those rules in an agricultural-based society and would have been so overwhelming that it had been very difficult for some people to keep it. So what the rabbis did, they created within the Pharisees groups of people called chaber, friends, who would have kept these food purity laws, to not make sure not to touch the fruits when their hands were impure, make sure to eat it in purity, make sure no one else around them who was impure would eat them. But it was so much more than you can imagine. It's not probably a meal that you can even imagine today. That they made sure not only that they tithed properly, but they wouldn't share a meal with anyone who would not fall into this category. To be even admitted and to be a chaver, a friend, you have to declare that you'll never eat one of these foods without being tithed. Not only that, that you will not sell any of your food to what we call Amaretz, people of the land, Jews who are not keeping or following the tithing laws or the purity laws so much. You ready for this? That you would not share a table with another Jew who was not keeping the purity laws. Because what they might definitely you wouldn't eat at their table because they don't tithe properly. And if you're a tax collector, times 1,000. The actual Jewish texts go both ways. Sometimes they say tax collectors keep the laws of 2% donation. Sometimes it doesn't. So it depends on what kind of how evil the tax collector was. But for the most part, they wouldn't sell anything to these. They wouldn't, if the fruit was wet, they wouldn't let anyone touch it. It goes on and on. So if the Pharisees were worried about Jews keeping tithing laws and worried about ritual purity around fruits and vegetables, such that if you weren't keeping it, you couldn't eat at their table. I want you to now read the story, just read it to yourself again. And keep in mind now, the rabbis wouldn't share a table with another Jew who was not keeping these ritual laws perfectly, was not keeping these donation laws, agricultural laws perfectly. And the people who you're unsure about would have been the regular Jews. But you know who you'd be less unsure about? The people you'd probably be certain that are messing up? They're the tax collectors and the sinners. So when we read the word sinners, I want to note for you the ambiguity. It could be they're sinning by stealing, raping, murdering. It could be they're sinning by not keeping the tithing laws. And it could be they're sinning by not keeping the purity laws. So the rabbis you could look at their criticism from two perspectives, the Pharisees. One, it could be if you want to be a holy person, if you want to be one of the people who are leading the Jewish people, you have to be one of these chavers, one of these friends. And the only way you could do that is if you keep purity laws. If you could ensure that people are not stealing from God, stealing literally tithes. So when they say, how does your person eat with these people? It could be that these people, it's not that they're sinning against man, it's that these are people who, if you want to be a holy person, you're accidentally excluding yourself, Jesus, from any future tenure as a holy person. It could be that he doesn't even know how to be a holy person, according to the Pharisees, and therefore they don't tell Jesus because Jesus doesn't care. Who do they tell? They tell the disciples, they go, your guy who you want to be a holy leader, he doesn't even know how to be a holy leader. He doesn't know what he's doing. In order to be a holy leader, you have to be a Pharisee, you have to be a Chaver, you have to have God on your team, you have to keep the purity laws, you have to keep the agricultural laws. We also see this specifically, just so you know, it's not only a Pharisee thing, in the Qumran community, in the Essene community. And when you read the Qumran community's book, like the community rule, or if you read the Halacha book, what you'll see is in order to be part of the Yachad, the community meal, you would have to commit to keeping their laws and keeping their purity laws, keeping their agricultural laws. And if you didn't do that, you know what the punishment was? You couldn't eat the communal meal. You couldn't be part of the team. But you're obviating that possibility by saying you're not part of the team. So it could be that Jesus cared about the purity rules and cared about the agricultural. We don't know. But by him breaking bread with these people, he was excluding himself from being a leader for the Pharisees. And this is, I think, the most important read of this. It's not Jesus is going to respond how you think, but the actual criticism that the Pharisees are lodging at the disciples is very clear. Who do you eat and drink with? Why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors? Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why is he doing that? It makes no sense. It excludes him. Okay, so that's one historical
So,
background.
so I think what you're touching upon, is the subversive nature of
Well, we
Jesus'
give the answer here.
message.
You're
You know,
giving
huh?
the answer, subversive. But I think the actual question,
Yeah,
I'm just pointing out the historical and cultural context
yeah,
of cultural and purity laws that Jesus was subverting by
correct.
eating
Yeah,
with these people.
and I think,
And the question would have made sense.
yeah, I think so. You're correct. So in that, because he was changing the what was believed to be true, or the way of life, the God ordained way of life at this time. He was changing that, and so it's not from a place of ignorance. He was intentionally, subversively going against that, doing this again in a certain way. And so I can see, in that context, I think we can see why the Pharisees asked him this question, like, why is he even doing this? Does he not know the law? Like, does he not know, if he, by doing all this, that he's excluding himself from all these other people, from the other, to your point, the Pharisees and the Haverir, and the others. And I think so. From Christian, so this in a way summarizes, I think, at least how Christians understand the gospel. That, at least the way we've understood this, where, again, this Old Testament, God's law was there. We had these things, and with Jesus, he changes the whole paradigm. And so we tend to, from a perspective, we bring that Christian perspective into this reading, and that's how this becomes a very common message. But also that the concept of sinners keeps tax collector sinners, it changes with every generation. Right now, we don't think of tax again. It takes a different context, and so. Well, Rabbi, yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I think from their perspective, they could also be angry and like, why is he doing this? By doing this, is he not excluding himself from us, or we can't, engage with him or not be the same table with him? And he, was changing the paradigm, was changing the social structure and that was doing that and was doing that intentionally.
Yeah, I think that is a great point, and we'll have to see what his actual perspective is on what is he trying to accomplish. So you would just say he's trying to break the social paradigm, but we'll have to see if there's a deeper message or what he is trying to accomplish. So Isaac, just want to do you want to?
Maybe let's put a pause on this and then we can
Okay,
begin
that's
because
what I thought.
yeah.
Okay. So we thought we're going to be able to do three verses at once, and we did not. So we will start the next time from verse 12.
Yeah,
Okay.
so Rabbi, so what he's saying is that by doing this, he made the Pharisees the other, or he excluded them from his group because of what he did. Because of
Well,
what he did,
so I mean, like, I'm not sure if he's making them the other. He's definitely making himself the other, because I think there's all these different classes of people. There's the Roman class of people. And again, when we talk about sinners and tax collectors, it's hard to identify in which group that sinners and tax collectors are more identified with. If you're a sinner, like today, let's say someone is living in a theocracy and he's the sinner, it probably means he doesn't identify with the majority theological rule. And it could be like he doesn't view himself as a sinner. He just says, I don't agree with this. So it's unclear where these tax collectors fit in, but it's also unclear where Jesus fits in. If Jesus could have been the head Pharisee, would he have done that for the most amount of influence? It seems like he probably wouldn't have, but it does seem that he's still running. Like Jesus could have started another religion on the spot, saying, "I'm not trying to influence the Jews." At least during Jesus' time, there's until we see that the religion really expands to other groups, as we spoke on in the past, that it seems that Jesus really focused on the Jews. And it's unclear why. Wasn't he going to all the Romans who were living in Judea at the time or in Galilee at the time? So this is something that we'll have to see about how to understand what Jesus is trying to accomplish and what is his attitude towards Pharisees, towards regular Jews, towards Chaverim, as we just mentioned, maybe towards the Essene community, towards Romans at the time. Does he have a different attitude if you're a Roman pagan who's actively worshiping paganism and some level of what Jews would consider at the time as idolatry or not? So it's hard to know how is anyone beyond beyond the cusp of Jesus accessing this time, or is really everyone accessible? So these are really great questions that's hard to know from what Jesus says and how Jesus is portrayed in the synoptics.
and so yeah, Rabbi, thank you. So some of these things are unclear, but I think when I read verse 9-11, the audience is primarily Jewish or tax collecting sinners. I take them to be like they're Jewish. Again, tax collectors were Jew. I mean, they were, so that's my.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's hard to know. I would assume they're Jews because I would assume the tax collector was working, but we're never sure of anything completely. But does
So what he's saying is that tax collector might have all this, might
well, I'm
have
saying even if
non
the sinner
non
was Jewish, he might have
non
been culturally Roman. That's
non-cultural Roman, yeah. So he might have all these his Roman friends, and so he might have included them, brought them, invited them to his.
there might be pig at this table, which would have been anathema. Again, like I explained this from an agricultural and from a purity law perspective, but maybe there's just non-kosher food there. Like how could you be eating there?
Yeah, so I think so in so many ways he's subverting the social structure again, the way of life, the believed way of life at this time, and maybe in this he's sowing the seeds for again for the future interpretations of the gospel, and maybe yeah, so that's we again it's more we can unpack on that.
Exactly. Okay. Well, we'll call
Okay.
it a day.
Well, Rabbi, on that note, thank you and have a great day.
Okay, you too.